Welcome back, everybody. We're glad to have you. Today we're doing something a little bit different. Christy and I are in two different locations because we have Hurricane Florence bearing down on us, and we're unable to get together to do this. So we're doing this through a video conference call. We hope it will work and be a blessing to you as always. Today we're going to be in chapter 3 of James, and this is our third week in the Smith and Helway's Formation series on the book of James. And this week our central question is, how does wisdom shape my speech and my life? And we've got a lot to talk to you about, but let's start with verse 1 of James 3 that says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." You know, Christy, for you and I, this really hits home as, Sunday school teachers. We can really take this to heart, and, we understand that, while on the one hand, we certainly are blessed every week by the kindness of our class and their affirming comments to us, and, we so value all that, but at the same time, it's an awesome responsibility for us, isn't it, to be a teacher. What do you think James was really getting at here, opening chapter 3 with this idea that teachers need to understand that they're going to be judged with to a higher standard of strictness?
Sure. So I think James was really speaking to some of the Jewish rabbis who were elevated to rabbi positions because they felt like a position of power. And I think oftentimes he was trying to address the fact that people really can use their power in some tough ways. And their words can influence and impact others so much. And so, Joe, when I look at our role as a Sunday school teacher, our roles don't just stop when our classes stop on Sundays. And we're trying to facilitate just this good discussion about the Bible and God's Word. And it just doesn't stop on Sunday. I mean, people do look at how we act, what our words say, how is that reflected in our lives, what does our journey look like when we walk by, or are we leaving roses and positive things versus do we have a line behind us of nothing but bad things and destruction in our path? So it really did speak to me, and it reminded me and convicted me of the fact that I do have a big responsibility, and I don't want to let people down, but more importantly, I don't want to let God down because I feel like He's called me to teach, and I want to make sure that what I'm doing is certainly His will. And it's a very powerful verse. We could probably have a whole Sunday school lesson verse. So what about you?
Well, I just think about, the historical setting, kind of like what you talked about. I just think about, James was very concerned about, there was probably teachers who, were in that. And I expanded not just to teachers, but leaders, because I think the teachers were the leaders. And I think there was probably some people who wanted those jobs because there was a certain prestige or power. I mean, there were people who were ambitious and wanted to be teachers, and it's probably no different today. And, I think anytime somebody really wants to be a teacher, it's worthy of raising an eyebrow maybe and just looking at what the motive is. But anyway, I think it's interesting. I think he was very concerned that as the teacher went and as the leader went, so would the community go. And so his concern was that the community would be led astray by somebody who was just trying to fulfill their ambitions. And, he goes from there into talking about speech or the tongue. And, I love what he says in verse 2 as we kind of get into that. He says, "For all of us make many mistakes," not just mistakes, but many mistakes. "Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect." Well, I'm not sure that any of us could say we've never made a mistake in speaking. I mean, other than Jesus, probably nobody. Certainly James was probably convicting himself because he says we. But he says anybody who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. What does that verse say to you?
So for me, First, I have to say that I love the fact that James just comes right out and he sort of convicts himself to say, for all of us make many mistakes. I mean, he's including himself. And,
sure.
and I like that about this piece of scripture here. And in terms of the word perfect, I'm with you. I don't think there's anyone who can say that they've never sort of tripped over their words or tripped over their tongue. And no one is perfect. And to me, that word translates to your spiritual maturity. Are you able to keep your tongue in check all the time? And basically, you need help doing that. And the tongue is such a small piece of your body, but it controls so much. A majority, it's all connected. I think I read something this week where it said, there is a reason that God created a set of teeth around your tongue and also your mouth around around your teeth. And when you stop and think about that, you think, I understand why now. And it's just like the illustration with a large, powerful horse. You've got to have a bit and a bridle to be able to guide and direct. And I think that for us, being able to control our speech, sort of guiding and directing, we can't do that by ourselves. And we've got to have the help of the Lord to be able to do that. And we keep working towards spiritual maturity. I don't know that we keep working towards perfection, because I don't know that we'll ever achieve that. But certainly, I think it's logical to say that we're working towards that spiritual maturity, just like Jesus. And, he's the only one that was really able to control his tongue in the big scheme of things. So, Joe, I know that you've got a lot of experience with sailing, and you've been around a boat or two. So what did you think about the illustration of the rudder?
Yeah, it is pretty amazing, and that such a small part can have such control over it. And I guess, I think he was probably referring to the teacher. The teacher was the one person, but yet controlled the entire community. And, looking at verse 6, he talks about, verse 5, he says, so also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. And I get the sense that some of these teachers were probably boasting about these great exploits. In other words, it was very self-centered. It was really about them. It was not about Jesus. And he's basically saying, hey, that's a problem. And, in addition to the power of the tongue, he talks about the destructive nature of the tongue and even the source of that destruction. He says, it's like a fire, and it's like a spark that can just set the whole forest on fire. And he even goes on to say, it says it sets it on fire, the cycle of nature, and is itself set on fire by hell. And so we almost get a sense of the demonic nature of the tongue, and it's really the human spirit. This is very difficult. I mean, I think that, listen, for all of us, as the line that stuck with me this week is, as our tongue goes, as our speech goes, so goes our life. Because we've all had experiences where we said something and instantly wished we hadn't, or knew that it was going to be a problem and had to live through that. And we wonder, why did I say that? We just can't believe that we did that in retrospect. There is this humanness that comes. I mean, our tongue is just such a reflection of our human nature, which is by nature very selfish, very self-centered, and it just speaks to the difficulty of this. And I don't know. It's just, how about what did you see as anything you would add to that?
Sure. So the reference to the fire being so destructive. The illustrations of the bridle and the bit and the rudder, to me, are more about the teacher guiding and directing and influencing and sort of steering people in the right direction. Right. So that's more of the positive outcome. the fire illustration to me was much more of that, like you said, destructive piece. And I read somewhere, I can't coin this phrase, I wish I had been smart enough to think of it, but really referencing people who were in teaching or leadership roles and they used words in a harsh way. They were spiritual arsonists. And I thought that was interesting because they were starting a negative fire that with their words because they were directing people in the wrong way and that their words were being destructive, and it wasn't really about celebrating God. It was more about their self-promotion. And I thought that was an interesting concept there, of being a spiritual arsonist when you use words in a very negative way, and what damage it can do. It talks about being a deadly poison. And you can imagine, you've heard stories of people who have been in church settings and maybe the words from the leader, from the preacher or whatever have been harsh, and that's really impacted their lives, and maybe they have turned away from God because of the words that they heard someone, and that those kinds of things resonated with me. And I think the other thing is just this whole phase of verses from, say, 2 to 9. It really is talking about we've got two paths. Our words can be so powerful, and they can lead to a negative result, or we can use words to be so powerful and it can impact someone in such a positive way. And it's really about the wisdom that we have that will guide which way we go. And that sort of rolls us in, I guess, to one of the last sections of the scripture here, in verses 10 through 18. And he asked the question, who is wise and understanding among you? And it's interesting that he brings up that theme of wisdom. And how many times have we spoken about that recently, Joe?
Yeah. Well, it seems to be a real theme throughout James. He's certainly one who was familiar with the wisdom language that we find in Old Testament Proverbs and maybe some of the Psalms and different places. But this whole idea of wisdom from above or wisdom from below is just really, really powerful. And, when we think about people who are wise, what we're really talking about is they seem to have maybe answers, or they have good advice, but he really refers more to the fruits of the wisdom. He said, hey, when you're looking at these teachers and these leaders in your community, look at the weight behind them. Don't just hear their words, but see what the fruits of those words are. And the whole idea of the fruit of our speech, I think we can all relate to it. I mean, he talks about the wisdom from below. It says, such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and devilish. And says, where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will be disorder and wickedness of every kind. So when he's talking about this, there were many of these teachers who claimed and boasted, apparently, of their great exploits, and people probably got caught up in it, but it all led them down a bad path because it wasn't from God. Now, what about the other type of wisdom?
Yeah, so in verse 17 he says, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. Joe, I can't help but to think he's talking about his half-brother there. Right. And that is the real example that he is showing us that, hey, if you have wisdom from God, you will be able to yield these fruits, good fruits. And when you look at Jesus' life and you see what James saw, that was his example from his big brother. And
right.
what an impact that made. Of course, I still can't fathom the fact that, wow, your half-brother is Jesus. I mean, talk about sibling rivalry there. But yet, look at how fortunate James was to have him as an example. And I think this is really, he's describing all of the characteristics, that perfection, that spiritual maturity that he's referencing in the earlier verses. I really think that he's talking about, hey, look, this is what we need to be striving for. These are what your leaders and your preachers and your teachers look for, these things along the way.
And to get that wisdom, we're reminded that, the way we get that wisdom, this is not wisdom from our realm of the world. It's wisdom from above, which really is about the relationship we have with God, our prayer life, taking time to study the Word, the acts of service, of selfless service. Anytime that we follow, and these are all things that lead us to operating out of this sense of godly wisdom. It's available to us if we'll just ask. That's a big part of what James believes, and he ties it all back to works, right? We're all the way back to works again. I mean, these are all the works. Our speech is works. What we say is part of that. And one of the interesting illustrations that you and I both stumbled into this week as we did our research was about I guess it was from a sermon, and I don't recall who it was, but the illustration was that when he was a young boy, and he would go to the doctor, the first thing the doctor would say is, open your mouth wide, stick out your tongue, and say, ah. And how he thought, boy, a doctor must really know a lot about my health just by looking at my tongue. Well, there's a spiritual reality to that statement, and that is that we can learn a lot about what's in our heart, and what kind of wisdom we're tied into based on taking a look at our tongue or our speech or the things that we say. And so anyway, that was my big takeaway this week is just to remember that it's not possible for us to do this out of earthly and human wisdom and our own efforts. We have to appeal to godly wisdom if we want to have any chance of not leaving a path of destruction because of the things that we say, that we often say, I didn't mean to say that, but did we really not? I mean, it came out of our mouth.
Right.
So that was my big takeaway for the week.
Right. And as you said earlier, Joe, sort of as your speech goes, so does your life. And
yes.
These two things are inseparable. In something that I read earlier, there was a story of a preacher who actually was doing a sermon on James, the whole book of James. And he made a note that speech and the tongue is so important. And if you go back and you look at all 5 chapters of James, there is a reference to your speech and controlling your tongue. And he put a lot of emphasis back in that first chapter of James where it talks about you should be quick to listen and slow to
right.
And so what he did was he shared with the congregation that on average we speak somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 words per day. So we've got 30,000 shots at getting it right. But at the same time, we've got 30,000 shots of getting a lot of it wrong. And so what he did was he challenged the congregation for 24 hours to keep a journal of all of the kind words that came out of their mouth versus the words that maybe weren't so kind and weren't controlled, and to do it for 24 hours, to see if they could go for 24 hours and to watch their speech, watch their tongue, pray about it, read the scriptures, what does it say about it, and to see what the effect was at the end of those 24 hours. And it was just an interesting read for me.
Yeah.
And a lot of his congregation came back and said, this is really hard because here I am trying to do all the right things, and then at the same time I may slip and say something. And they were saying, when you have to be accountable on paper and you sit down and you look at what you've done, it's a real eye-opening thing. And I think what James is reminding us of here is not only will teachers and leaders be accountable in front of God, but we're going to be accountable just, as human beings about how our words reflect our life. And what do people see when they hear, what do they see when they hear what we say, and
right.
will it impact their lives? So I just love I love this chapter, and I think it has a lot of wonderful advice for everyone, and it's a good reminder. And I'm going to see if I can take that 24-hour challenge and see where I go with it. But I thought that was a really neat exercise for people.
That is. Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent. Well, Christy, this has been a fun lesson for us, and I think certainly our hearts and prayers go out to all the people in North Carolina, South Carolina who are being impacted by the storm this week, and lives that are being impacted, property, businesses, and we just hope that they will sense God's presence this week, certainly. And next week we're going to come back and do chapter 4 of James, which has to deal with something that will have no bearing on any of us. It's about how to live our faith in the midst of conflict. And so that's certainly not applicable to anybody. And speaking of conflict, I just want to congratulate you on your win last week. I almost kind of wish I hadn't brought it up now, but your team looked really good, and now I have to wait a whole nother year to see if we have a chance. I don't know if we even play next year, but congratulations on the win.
No, it was a fun Saturday.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, listen, for everybody who's listening, we appreciate you spending a few minutes with us this morning. We hope this has been a blessing to you. Think about the wisdom from above as it relates to your speech this week, and think about Christy's example of the challenge. We'd love to hear from you. If any of this has been helpful to you, just let Christy or I know. And we hope you'll join us again next week when we'll be back to talk about James chapter 4. Till then, everybody have a great week. God bless you. We'll see you next time.